Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Charles IT's presentation of Do You Really Need GCC High? My name is Larry Robertson. I am the General Manager of Charles IT Virginia. And with me today is my co-host, Anthony Buono. Anthony?
Yeah, so I am the major accounting executive here at Charles IT, and I help customers go through their requirements for licensing. And I have extensive experience in the defense contractor space, 13 plus years prior to being here, understanding the nuances of CMMC compliance and understanding how to protect data in regards to CUI ITAR data, but also understanding the nuances of the policies and procedures that need to come in play for organizations to do so. Great to have. Thanks for having me.
Great. Let's jump into it, Anthony. So let's start with the title. When a company comes to us and says, hey, we're a government contractor, so we need GCC High, is that necessarily true?
It is to a degree, but there's nuances to it. How they actually control their information is probably one of the most important elements of this. Their compliance concerns comes into play. What do they have for CMMC, but what are they looking for what they have today from an email perspective, but really the Office product. So Microsoft went through separating a couple things there, and this is kind of one of the ideas around how they're securing the information. But Microsoft play here is kind of where the license is just not it. And there's more of an architecture behind it, including security functionality, compliance concerns, details in regards to how they're doing protection as well. So it's going to be a great conversation.
So staying with this thought, what should they be asking us before they ever ask us for a GCC High quote?
Yeah. So one of the things is really what type of license model do they fall into today, and how do they protect that type of information? So the first question needs to be addressing what's there. So they need to understand what is the environment that they're actually supporting. And this goes back to their government contracts. The current business model that they're under, with their manufacturer or a components manufacturer or something to that nature in the defense contract space, the idea is understanding what is their contract flow downs. Those flow downs kind of give them ability for what their actual environment is. Now, is GCC High always required? Not necessarily. It depends on what they're having. If they're having and obtaining CUI ITAR data, that might be the nuance of why they need GCC High information to be shared and protected. There's different nuances to the license of what's there, but the idea around the strategy is really the impact of cost, compliance, and operations, right? So there's risks. There's risks in regards to having a commercial, a Microsoft tenant, now a government Microsoft tenant, how to separate and control what's there for the security pieces of it and having compliance needs addressed right off the bat.
But Anthony, what are you seeing organizations get wrong when they begin the conversation?
Well, one, they don't want to spend a lot of money. That's usually some of them, but they get wrong is they don't know where to go. They don't know what type of license that they need. They don't know what type of data or the nuance of how far do they need to go to do the protection layers that are after the fact. Just buying a license isn't always just the answer. There's more to it. They might have to do a migration later on. They might have to support different modalities, email filtering capabilities might be different in regards to their configuration. So there's nuances to how they set up their environment and how they actually control what is that policy. So there's a lot of different things there that come into play.
Gotcha. So what I hear you saying is that choosing the wrong environment can create operational problems beyond simply just paying too much for the licenses.
That's right. There's a difference between a G3 and a G5 license for certain customers. They don't even know what that means. So having to explain that and understanding the nuance in regards to what security features happen because of that information, that's key. Sometimes they don't even know what type of data that they're seeing. They just know that it's a requirement for CUI or ITAR data. So there comes a different conversation right off the jump that happens for most customers.
All right, great. So let's move to the next slide. And let me ask this question. In plain English, what's the difference between Microsoft's commercial cloud, GCC, and GCC High?
So one of the things that happened back in 2014 timeframe for Microsoft is they always had what was the commercial cloud, and everyone understood kind of working through that cloud. How do you protect data? The government had some, I would say, opportunity to change things. There was projects and programs that were in play that were protecting data. They understood and realized that they need to stand up a government cloud. That government cloud kind of then predicted what was actually happening, because then you had sharing information within that cloud. Microsoft then extended a different license architecture in regards to what's there. So the government cloud is an environment for building organizations to handle sensitive data. So really, that's federal data coming from federal environment. So if you're building something for the strike fighter, I would say the F-35 strike fighter program, you might have sensitive data that is both CUI and or ITAR. That becomes a restriction to what's there. What it is really designing support for your compliance. And CMMC comes into play because you either are level 2 or level 3, depending on if you're a prime or sub, but understanding that proper configuration for the security architecture of those licenses. Having a separate isolated environment from the commercial cloud from Microsoft is an important aspect and a requirement from a FedRAMP authorization perspective, a flow down from your DFARS clauses that are within your CUI parameters for protection and security functionality. There's a DISA impact to it as well. And then there's the ITAR and export controlled data environments. It's not just the license, it's about the people. How are we sharing the information? Who gets to have access to that information? So forth and so on. So it kind of brings together what is the nucleus of the environment. Not just securing Office 365. It becomes not just a plug and play compliance solution. It's not just a guarantee that CMMC is going to be okay. It's about the configuration management. It's about the policies and procedures. It's about the documentation and the security wrapping that happens around that security license. Because the GCC license, really, they're for the government community cloud. And that's dedicated to the US federal, state, and tribal government entities and their contractors. Looking at the contract mechanism here, that's where you're seeing it in those government contracts.
So if I buy GCC High tomorrow, what have I accomplished from a CMMC standpoint and what haven't I accomplished?
Yeah, so, you have different environments as you go through each one of the CMMC perspectives. So you accomplish things like protecting the type of data values that you have. So CUI and ITAR data coming into play again. What happens when you have that flow down on DFARS contract, that is your government, contract that you have in place today, that type of data that they need to share with you in order for you to build components, for example, how is that being protected? CMMC compliance evaluates the people in the process, but also the technology. This is a part of that technology piece, but you have to wrap the people in the process into this. And each individual person within your environment, in your company or architecture, has a specific email address. This now email address might be different than the commercial email. It might be now a new enclave. That federal enclave email then kind of brings all those together. So you're demanding, your evidence control, your compliance capabilities kind of come into the controlling for your policies and procedures. What it also does is it also answers the question for your NIST security controls. There's the 800-171 NIST security controls, which actually kind of take a place inside your audit for CMMC, for example, that ask you for certain things that are actually being done. Having a Microsoft GCC or GCC High license matters to regards to the security structure that's actually engaged. So there's ongoing management of that and what's going on within your environment itself. But the configuration of how you control the data, where they store that data and so forth and so on comes into play. So compliance is definitely something that comes into play a high role for CMMC. I would say the CUI controls, which is a part of your DFAR flow downs, CUI controls is commercial unclassified information. When you have CUI and you have ITAR, ITAR really kind of blends in what is, the arms control, but it stands for International Traffic and Arms Regulation. When you have CUI and ITAR data, it's very sensitive information, meaning certain people may or may not be able to have access to that information. That's a requirement for CMMC. That's a requirement to protect that information and where it goes and how it's stored and where it's shared, all within the environment. The federal cloud is one important step of that, making sure you have that in play right off the bat. So the compliance expertise kind of comes in play to make sure you have a broader strategy for what's there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Looking at the next slide, can you explain the difference between this distinction between Microsoft providing a platform supporting these requirements and the customer actually being compliant?
Yeah, so the platform is really the Microsoft, federal cloud, which we said. There's a separation between the commercial side and there's protection layers there in order to protect the environment that is working within this cloud. If you look at it from a cloud perspective, Microsoft wants to make sure all the government things are in the government cloud and all the commercial things are in the commercial cloud and not mixing those two things together. It gets extra sensitive when you have people like the US Navy doing such a thing. So, or people that are a part of the Space Force and having access to email, and how do they do it? So you can understand the enclave is very essential to what's actually happening in that environment. The protection of what's happening is probably the most important role that's actually taking place, because that compliance really talks about the cybersecurity envelope that's wrapped around what is happening in that environment. It comes down to the questions of what's happening with the data. How do we share that data? As an organization, you might be obtaining CUI data coming from email. The next question comes, how do you protect what's there? Who gets to see it? How do you share it or store it? Storing it in the federal cloud is kind of one of the most important elements of this that kind of goes as number one initiative. And then you have different details in regards to how it's actually kept beyond just your business premium licenses. So having access to that, having the security functionality that comes with the Microsoft piece, those will all come into play in regards to why it's used for CMMC, for example. So the cybersecurity modeling that takes place with CMMC is really taking a look at how your organization trusts and protects and has policies and procedures that actually enforce the element of security in regards to how you operate in data sets. And some of those data sets fall into you just getting an email. That email might contain a CUI data. How do you handle, first off, the email being able to accept that data if that marking's there? And two, how does that get to be either a read-only or a save to a SharePoint? That's that federal cloud. So there's different nuances that need to be in configuration that's way beyond just buying a new license.
Gotcha. So let's say that I'm a DoD contractor and I know CMMC Level 2 applies to me. Does that automatically mean GCC High?
Not necessarily. So it really depends on that data set and the function. You might need to have either a GCC or a GCC High license. Between the two, there's nuances in regards to why you need to protect certain types of data. CUI and ITAR come into play. If you think you have CUI today and you think you might be adding ITAR later, it's an interesting conversation, because wouldn't you rather have the better security features now instead of having to add them on later on? And getting to that point is really kind of the conversation that needs to happen of understanding the dynamics of where the organization is in regards to how they're obtaining their current contract status, where they're after it for new business, maybe in an RFP they're responding to, or maybe in a new business that they see coming in the future, but understanding where it actually is. Some of the, lower end, I would say municipalities, police departments, local government, state agencies, most likely they're on GCC licenses. But the defense contractor handling CUI, NIST security control implementation because of CMMC Level 2 or ITAR typically need GCC High licenses. So those are kind of the nuances between the two.
Gotcha. Moving to the next slide, let me ask you this scenario. So I think people hear that Microsoft 365 migration and they go, wow, this is just moving emails and files. How much bigger is a GCC High migration than that?
Yeah, it's large. It's a huge undertaking because they don't realize what it actually impacts to what they're managing in-house. It's the big difference between asking that question to someone who's handling that as an IT manager at an organization or a defense contractor compared to like an MSP, a managed service provider, or a managed security service provider that might be managing their emails going from that perspective. How they handle not just the email now comes into play, because the data set, like I described earlier, the CUI and ITAR data comes into play of how do you handle it. Handling that information really starts to talk about how the comparison between what you need to do. People don't always know what they need. You might have to ask some discovery questions to get them to understand, here's why you need this license. Now, there's also risks in not buying it ahead of time, but there's an idea around how you actually get to that license that's proper for your organization. So how do you handle CUI? That's controlled, unclassified information. When does your contracts, what is the requirement that you have? What's the requirement from the DFAR flow downs that are a part of the contracts you have today? And then what's your ITAR or export control information that you might be seeing or might be seeing in the future that might impact the license that you buy today as well. So different pieces depends on your data, your contracts, and your compliance obligations, but there's different conversation there right off the jump that understands where all that is. There's different challenges. As we see on the slide, there's different challenges that kind of drive toward then the process. Where's the sensitive data live? How do you access it? How do we do data flow boundaries? Imagine an organization that has drawings for the F-35 strike fighter, and you're looking at that on a tablet or a phone or your laptop. And a person has one email that's on GCC High, and they're able to download or access that information. You need to make sure you're protecting all of those information details. And this goes more into the CMMC architecture, but the framework that helps you align what needs to be protected within that environment. Again, the email from Microsoft, in this case, the GCC High email, only allows you to get the information. It's what you do with that information and how you do and perform the protection layer, the cybersecurity layer around it is what really matters. So that's really one of the key perspectives here when you start to think about the challenges that kind of drives everything forward. Does that make sense?
It does. So what I hear you saying is we're really rebuilding a controlled Microsoft environment, not simply moving mailboxes and files.
That's right. So it's more than just the mailboxes and files, because when you start to look at just the email, that seems to be, we answered the question, but there's so many more questions that follow that go into that migration piece, which can be an option that you can require to move all of your business professional licenses, if you regard your commercial tenant, to the government tenant, if that's something you needed to do. That migration is an upheaval of all of that process and understanding what server that it's on or what cloud that it's on or how it's being protected. But more importantly, it's the policies and procedures that follow that you need to make sure you're documenting as well from a cybersecurity perspective.
Gotcha. So on this next slide, why can't we simply look for the least expensive GCC High licenses that gives users Office and email?
Yeah, it's not just the cost. It's a lot. There's a lot of different details in what's actually there. It's not just about, what's happening. So Intune comes into play. How do you do device management of where that data is, like the tablet and the phone that I mentioned earlier? How do you enable conditional access policies and support compliance reporting and understanding identification of your access of the data set itself, right? CUI and ITAR data become the most critical conversation that you have in regards to what type of data you're having. Identifying that and understanding where your compliance concern is as your audit will be maybe for CMMC Level 2 in the future. Aligning those controls matters to why you have a Microsoft or an M365 G3 license or a G5 license. And it's a central strategy to start. Doesn't mean it's the end, because it wraps around a lot of other policies and procedures that you're going to need to think about in regards to how you're protecting that data. So not every license piece here just answers the question. There's so much more to it than just buying one license. So one of the fallouts here that happens is the miss is really talking about where's the endpoint gaps, missing Intune endpoint gaps, not one size fits all licensing. Not everyone needs a G3 license. Not everyone might need a G5 license. There's different levels and security for each one, depending on what's there. There's a nuance to the GCC and GCC High. So understanding the scope of what's there and understanding what's there from a compliance objective later on, and aligning that CUI boundary is very, very important right up the front.
So to break it down a little bit further, does every employee necessarily require the same license, or should licensing be designed around the roles and the CUI boundaries?
Yeah, not necessarily. It really is designed around the roles and the CUI boundaries. I have a lot of customers that'll ask the question, I only need 3 licenses because these are the only 3 people touching that information. Then I ask them the question, what about the frontline workers? How are they obtaining their information? Oh yeah, they'll get the CUI data. Then all of a sudden it turns into more people need it. The question comes into who is actually operating within the company that actually can see or modify or change or just view that type of information. CUI information, ITAR information, who is accessing it? Is it just coming from an RP and the sales team understands that? Is it the executive team that's engaged? That's fair. Most of the time, that's usually the case. Then the question is, what about a drawing that needs to go to the shop floor? Is that drawing protected with a CUI marking? Is it printed on a piece of paper and left on that shop floor? Well, that policy is going to change, right? So then now all of a sudden it's electronic. Who has access to that and who doesn't? Who is a US only employee and who is a foreign national? Can those people have access to that data? There's a conversation that needs to happen in regards to why or why not people have or do not have access to the federal cloud, in this case, the Microsoft GCC or GCC High license for them to protect that type of data.
Gotcha. So this next slide, there's 10 questions, but should an organization remember, if given only 3, as the most important from this list?
Well, I think the most important one from the beginning set of information that you can ask as a question is, what type of data are you receiving? So right off the beginning of the conversation, I'm going to ask CUI or ITAR data. Is it one? Is it both? And then I also ask, is it now just CUI and maybe later ITAR? How do you know where that's going to change, or when do you anticipate that change? That's a key question, because buying the license today is an investment. It's a yearly cost, and making a change to that yearly cost mid-year, that can impact everything. So financial pieces here of why to buy a license, it's kind of one of the things that helps them from a financial perspective, but understanding to future-proof themselves later on. Now, the second is, what is the requirements from their data set, from their contracts? Do they require GCC or GCC High? Is that language in the contract? Is there certain compliance driver options that they're seeing in contract language that's making them ask the question, I need a GCC license, or I need a GCC High license? And do they even understand the differences between that? I typically share what are the nuances between the two, but the idea is what's there. The worst part is, I don't want an organization to just buy a license and think it's okay. I want to make sure that we're understanding exactly the people that they're going to need it. If they're going to need just a new tenant, set up that new tenant, get a couple emails on there to get started, and then add on later on. Or is it a full migration of their whole entire operation? There's 2 different conversations there in regards to, does this include or need a migration project for the future? There might be more to it than they need to unravel, and more than they can actually handle within their environment. The last piece is pricing. Microsoft just went through a July 1st pricing change. That July 1st pricing change, that impacts, how people go. I don't want them to have to buy something new and now a new price comes into play, and that impacts them as far as what they're budgeting for. So each year there's a budget piece of this, but there might be changes as the year goes on. If you get a new contract that now employs ITAR and you only bought a GCC license, you might need to upgrade to GCC High. There might be a reason why you need to do that mid-year or within your contract, to middle of your contract, understanding that there's a price change that needs to happen there as well. So it's very interesting of how that works overall in regards to what's happening in your environment.
So if I look at this, from one of the takeaways that I would take away is that it's not just an IT decision, a compliance decision, or a leadership decision. It's an organizational decision, right?
It is. And it goes down to the levels of, it's not just the IT manager asking the question, it's the compliance team. How is this going to help with compliance, if they have one? What is the direction and the leadership team of the executive leadership, right? Where are they going? What types of contracts are they going after? What is the future looking like? I typically ask, what percentage of your business is actually government contracts? If it's less than 10%, that's one conversation. I think that's different than someone that says it's 80% of my business. Well, 80% of your business, and who isn't? If you're working with the defense contract, the primes, and you're working with Lockheed Martin, for example, or General Dynamics or something of that nature, you're going to need a little bit of a higher class of sensitivity of some of that data set. So I know that right off the beginning, but understanding where they need to go from a strategy perspective and their future proofing for, like, if they're going to add, different contract might include ITAR in the future, or an RP that they responded to, that might be something that they want to consider. So leadership is definitely a place in here, not just the IT manager, just asking or checking the box on, I need to buy a license.
So referencing this slide, what mistake causes the most trouble in real world projects?
Yeah, there's a couple different pieces here that you get into play in regards to the most common, or what you happen to be sideways or problems that arise, right? Assuming GCC High is a shortcut to CMMC compliance. Interesting comment, but does it answer all the pieces? No. It's just one part. There's so much more than that, than just saying I could just, CMMC needs it and I need to have it, and that just checks it off the box. That's not it. There's more security functionality. There's policies and procedures. There's evidence. There's things that in regards to the boundary of how CUI is actually controlled, used, and stored and shared. There's different things in regards to what you need to understand before you just buy that license. So can't fall into that shortfall. You got to ask questions or be ready to answer some of the questions that might be hard to answer. Sometimes, you might have, if there's, people that need to have access to that data set because you're on the manufacturing floor has something that's digitally connected to the network, and you're sending that job for that project to be completed via email, and that has a CUI or ITAR marking on it, that changes your policy that you may not be if you were just not doing that before. So there's different pieces that you could fall into that pitfall there. Underestimating what needs to be done from a tenant setup or getting to a migration. So there's two different things there. Setting up the tenant, you have to pre-qualify at Microsoft in order to be okay to receive a GCC or GCC High license. So there is a portal that you go to register yourself as a defense contractor or a sub or a prime. And they ask you a few questions and you go through the point where they register you on their site. Once you get that pre-registration, then they say, okay, now you're open to getting these licenses, right? So they have to pre-register you first. Not everyone could just have access to it. So there is a little bit of a restriction there. So setting up that enclave then becomes the first step. You set up the enclave, they buy a license, we provision that license from Microsoft, they activate the license and they put it into that tenant. So that tenant setup is really the beginning stage. Now, when you start to talk about the migration complexity, that starts to talk about where are you from before you bought this license, if you have business premium licenses, for example, and how do you migrate individuals or the whole entire team or a department or the whole organization to that new migration of the new GCC High tenant. So there's different conversations that need to happen there in regards to the licensing piece. Missing the endpoint and device management requirements is a key factor. I mentioned earlier, having a laptop, having a tablet, having a phone. How do you download that information? Well, I have GCC High email and I have CUI and ITAR data coming across my phone. Well, if I own that phone, where does it get stored? Does it go to a SharePoint only? Is it a read-only access? How does that get done? Can I change what's there? A lot of those are part of the cybersecurity controls, and then looking at that cybersecurity configuration and those controls across the board. And then the other thing is really coordination across IT compliance and leadership and all of the people using this. This is a gap change. This is something that happens within an organization that's different than the way they handle their business premium license from a normal commercial environment. So treating this as an afterthought is never a thought and never something that's good, but treating the documentation ahead of time, understanding the security functionality that needs to be done, planning ahead for migrations or management of the systems that you're actually setting up, that's really important for the operation itself.
So given your experience and a poorly planned GCC High project, at what point does an organization usually realize they've underestimated their scope?
Yeah, I think it's right in the beginning. I think right from the beginning, they think like, the DFARS contract says I need a GCC license and I think that sets the bar and I'm good. I buy that and I'm all set. What they don't realize is all the other elements from the cybersecurity posturing, if you will, that happens within that environment now, because there's so many impacts to how you store data, how you use SharePoint, how you use OneDrive, how you have Intune engaged, how you have what's called Entra ID as well. But there's a nuance even in Teams. Teams is different in that environment. So there's a different security architecture in regards to how you share your screen, how things operate, how things go. So having that readiness assessment in the beginning and also understanding how you have CMMC compliance later on, that helps you understand what are the answers to the questions you're going to set up right from the beginning. So very beginning stages, you need to understand the impact changes of what's happening, but understanding what's the future gap of what's going to happen from your audit or your CMMC level 2 compliance or something that might be your cybersecurity concern. Because once you get the license, there's more to it than just being the license itself. There's details of security that need to be controlled. And that's a policy and procedure change. That might be an impact to the organization. So there's things that also get extended to that. So there's different ways that people kind of go through what's there. Having a system security plan in place, having a plan of action milestone report ready for CMMC. Well, guess what? This is one of those elements that now impacts how are you handling the data. So data as an email is the source to transfer that information. CUI is the type of information that's being shared. ITAR might come into play. How is the security functionality in regards to what's there? So the supporting of that already comes into play across the board. And then it's really planning ahead for what you're going to be doing in the future. So the compliance audit itself and what's really happening. But the idea, a license doesn't just answer the question. There's things that you need to do as an organization in order to protect the environment that's actually being procured that you actually have access to going forward.
Oh, Anthony, this next question is a multi-part question. So I'll give you the first one and then I'll give you the two to break it down into. If GCC High is only one part of the CMMC readiness stack, what else needs to exist around it? And breaking that down, where do things like SSP, the POAM, policies, and security, logging, evidence, and collection fit into this? And when should an organization start thinking about assessment evidence after the migration or while they're designing and implementing the environment?
In my opinion, it's designing and implementing the environment right up front. So when you start to talk about what is being done, this is a security change that you're actually impacting to the organization. So an ask that people are getting right off the bat. So it's impacting other items that you didn't think about before or have in play before. So when you start to think about how, endpoint security is being done or how you're logging your security and information event management that's taking place, if you have a SIM in place, let's say that email gets hacked into, how is it protected on the GCC or GCC High environment? You start to talk about how Microsoft does what they do. That's fair, but you've got to report that incident. Now, all of a sudden, there's policies and procedures around what happens as a action and a reaction to what's actually taking place there. Can we isolate it to just the phone? Can we isolate it to just the tablet or the PC that it's on? Or is it the whole tenant that needs to come down? Or do we need to pause what's happening? There's a policy change that happens right there, and how that impacts the organization is very important in regards to how you're preparing early stages. What people don't realize is when they buy a license, they think that that's just solving the problem. What it then opens up is a bunch of can of worms, I call it, the can of worms problem of there's all the things that you now need to pay attention to that you may not have been enforcing before. By the way, go back to your NIST security controls and understanding how you're addressing that to understand your policies and procedures. Because if you don't enforce certain things, it doesn't work. So you have to make sure you have your score and you're up to speed in regards to your SPURS capabilities and what your SPURS score is, but really your CMMC compliance for NIST security controls, but changing the way your operation operates. Because what's happening here is you're bringing a new security architecture into play, and you need to prepare for that very, very beginning stages of the detail.
So walk me through this. If I called you tomorrow and I said, Anthony, my contract says I need CMMC level 2, what's the first thing I do?
Well, I would say, let's talk through some questions. Your contracts you have today, are they directly with the government or are they coming from a prime contractor? How is the flow down operating? That's a question I would ask. But more importantly, I would ask what's in that contract that they're asking, because what type of data are you seeing from that current contract, or are you already seeing that information? Or is it they're not able to share information with you because you don't have the right security functionality to do so? That usually leads to what is your CUI obligations or what is the ITAR data that they're sharing. So how are you using it? How's it being shared? That detail, it's not just, what's there, it's the requirement. So the requirement comes typically where people are saying, okay, well, my DFARS contract says I need to have this. So, hey, Mr. Customer, I need to go buy Microsoft license to do this, right? And they think like, oh, that answers the question. Well, that's not just that. There's more things that need to be identified in the discovery questions up front that actually understand where they need to go. So identifying that scope, reviewing that contract requirement, that's one step. But a second step is really how are they mapping their sensitive data types? How are they defining their boundaries for ITAR data compared to CUI? One of the questions might be, how many US employees are touching that data and how many are not US employees? So if they're not born in the US, how can they touch that information? Maybe that needs to change. Maybe they need to hire a new team to do so. There's an impact to how things would go within their process. So it's more beyond just doing a transaction for like a part number or a SKU. It's more of what's going to happen within their environment, and then reviewing that license with them, and then understanding from an alliance perspective where leadership, compliance, and IT kind of bring all realms together, understanding what needs to be done for them to just set up that tenant, maybe for 2 or 3 people right now, or setting up a full migration of 100 people that need to get into that place. Those conversations need to happen in the beginning so they understand where they're going from the start and where they're going to end in regards to compliance and other things that they're doing. One of the other pieces here is making sure you buy the proper part number. Microsoft has different part numbers in regards to the license model. So, for example, there's an M365 G3 license, and then there's an M365 G5 license. And oh, by the way, there's a different nuance to that. There is a M365 G3 GCC option, and then a GCC High option. So 2 different prices, 2 different SKUs, 2 different part numbers. So which one do you need? And then how do I say, well, you think you need GCC G3, but maybe you need G5. And then this is what that includes. So there's nuances to the conversation in regards to why or why not they would need to go there. People don't just understand what that is. So you're walking down a path of discovery questions that help them get to the right answer.
So before we open it up to questions, what's the biggest single misconception you want everyone to leave here understanding?
I think one of the most important things right off the beginning of having this conversation and really looking at what's there is, are you ready for the license? And what I mean by are you ready is all the other impacts to everything within the organization that are going to be a concern. Now, a cybersecurity enforcement that's happening around all the other policies and procedures that you have. Buying a license doesn't just check the box. It's actually one of the things that actually helps you get to the configuration of policies and the details that are required for compliance. So yes, it answers the DFARS question and will flow down from a contract, but it's also going to address your compliance concerns as well. So what is the difference between GCC and GCC High? That's all comes down to the data that you're handling, in my opinion, and understanding what is your future proofing of what you're going to buy today. Understanding here's where you're at, here's the protection layer that you have. You might need this in the future. When you re-up this license, that might be your next step. Or do you want to consider buying that now from an investment perspective? And then the complexity piece, I think that people don't realize how complex this can get. There is a piece of this that understands what is the CUI and ITAR boundary. And there's a piece of it that understands that they want to migrate their whole entire operation over to GCC High email. When you start to talk about that migration, which is a separate thing that you could do, that's something that you need to do right away. Sometimes that's not. Sometimes the right thing is just, let's get a couple licenses, get those certain people seeing what is that CUI and ITAR data, and then you have that protected, add it on later on, or look at what you're going to extend to later. It's a planning procedure. So it's one of those things where people don't need to just jump in. You need to ask a lot of questions and be open to the questions that are going to be asked, because if someone just wants to sell you something, that's fine. But the idea is this is a consultative approach, understanding exactly what needs to happen in your environment to protect the data that you have.
So to go back on this, if someone that's listening today thinks they need GCC High, what's the first thing they do tomorrow?
I would make sure that they understand exactly and make sure they're sharing what type of data that they're actually collecting from their government contracts today. And in email, you might be having drawings, for example, you might have CUI markings on it, but then you might be seeing some that are ITAR restricted as well. There's a nuance to that, and there's a different security level in regards to what's there. So there's a definite key functionality of what they need to listen for inside their environment, even though they're just being asked to just buy a new license.
Gotcha. So Anthony, great information here. Let's open the floor up to questions. If you guys have questions, please type them in the Q&A panel and Teams, and we'll answer to the best of our ability.
So I see a question in here. It says, what does ITAR mean? That was probably be the first one that I see on the list. And so ITAR means is International Traffic in Arms Regulation. So it's a set of U.S. Department rules, State Department rules, if you will, that controls the export and defense articles, services, and technical data to protect national security. So as you can understand, ITAR data is something that might be supplied because it might be being used for you're building something for, let's say, the U.S. government. Let's say it's a drone or a satellite, or it could be an aircraft like the F-35 strike fighter. In that environment, there's protection statuses in regards to the technical data. Let's say you're building a part that goes on the wing of that aircraft. What do you need as specifics for that? Well, you're going to need drawings that show you the size, dimension, weight, power, maybe what it's made of. There might be some sensitivity to that. That's why it would be an ITAR data restriction. So there's different things there for that. A couple other questions I see in here. What does CUI mean? So definition of CUI is controlled unclassified information. Unclassified US government information that really still requires safeguarding and distribution of control under laws, regulation, and government-wide policy. What it really means is it's created by the US government that says that information specifically is not classified, but is protected. There's a privacy concern about it, but it's not a classified market. I worked in the world of secret and top secret, understanding that there's marking classifications that you get trained on the documentation. There's usually a CUI or ITAR marking on documentation. CUI really is controlled unclassed information, but has a sensitivity. And that's really where it needs to not be in the bad hands of the bad actors or the bad hands of the bad people. But the idea is it has a little sensitivity that we want to make sure we're protecting, and the government makes sure that everyone is protecting across the board.
There's another one. Just to confirm, is it fairly safe to say that if both CUI and ITAR data are being stored, shared, transmitted, et cetera, then GCC High is the best license route to take as opposed to GCC?
Highly suggested, yes, especially if you're mentioning ITAR. So when you mention the word ITAR, I'm going to say you need to go to a GCC High license. It depends on the data set, but when you mention ITAR, that's usually where that direction will go. So the answer is yes from that perspective. The difference now becomes, can you have a G3 or a G5 license? And there's different security functionality within G5, like Microsoft Defender for advanced threat protection, endpoint identity, and really your office products, if you will. But understanding there's different things, including Intune as well, but understanding what those security features are that would be included that you might want to just get to from a G5 license. So I would say yes, Microsoft M365 G5 GCC High license would be required then.
So I think we have time for one more. And how about this one? What typically surprises organizations the most once they understand everything that has to change?
It's a lot to swallow up front. They understand that the changes that are impacting is a policy and procedure change. They understand that it's not just now the license. It's like, ooh, I didn't think about that. We're going to have to write up a policy in regards to how we're storing data, right? Your SharePoint's going to change to the federal cloud. How does that, who has access to that data? Who can see or read-only access? Who can download that access? Who can have that information? There's a lot of nuance as to how the operation is controlling itself right now in the commercial world, and then how it will adjust to be controlled within the federal cloud world, right? So when Microsoft has a business premium partner license, and then you set up what is a GCC or GCC High license, you're in a different part of Microsoft. Microsoft stood up two different substantiations of that cloud. Having everything done in the federal cloud brings on different nuances to how you need to secure that data. It brings on differences in your policies and procedures. It impacts your CMMC posturing. It impacts what needs to be done. So those are all impacts to why people kind of see that across the board for what's going on in their environment.
Hey, Anthony, thanks for joining me today and sharing your knowledge and experience. There's a lot here, and I think we touched on pretty much everything you could and then some. To the audience, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please reach out to us and let us see if we can help you out. Thank you.
Thank you.